Welcome, everyone, to the YouTube channel for All Saints with Holy Trinity here in the grey, damp, fairly muggy Midlands. It's lovely to welcome you back to our YouTube channel. If you have arrived by accident, great to have you with us. This is one of the online spaces for Loughborough's Historic Parish Church. And if you're here intentionally, then hopefully you know what you're in for this Tuesday lunchtime. This is my weekly little online conversation entitled Minister's Muse, because I'm a fan of alliteration. And Minister's Muse is exactly what it says. It's four ministers getting together to muse together, to conjugate, I think that's the right word, to ponder the scriptures that are coming up on Sunday. The scriptures being the ones taken from the Revised Common Lectionary, which is a rhythm of readings that runs over a 3-year cycle, shared by Anglican, Lutheran, Methodist, generally speaking, tallies with Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, sometimes some diversions, but a rhythm of readings that takes us through the scriptures. And I sit down with some colleagues and we take a look at them and we share what's striking us, what's standing out to us, what's making us scratch our head. What do we have to go and look up in a concordance this morning? And what kind of sermon might we be preparing to preach? And we'd love to sort of share that with you and bring you on the conversation. So if you're with us this Tuesday lunchtime and you're here live, do please use the comments to join the conversation. Share with us your thoughts, ask any questions. Tell us what you're having for lunch. We don't mind, anything you fancy. So do join in. And if you're catching up later on in the week, these stay available on our YouTube channel. Then I just hope you find it a really edifying use of your time as we dive into the scriptures together. If you've been here before, you'll know that I've had some wonderful guests over the past year, and those guests are continuing to come back, but I'm really excited to tell you that I've brought some new people into me fold of musing. So I have a returning face today and two newbies, which I know you'll give a really warm welcome to. So while I type up into the comments the passages that we're looking at today, they're going to introduce themselves to you, tell you a little bit about their context for ministry, and I think tell you a little bit about whether or not they use sport in their preaching, because I'm just kind of interested to know. It's a bit of a sporty season. Okay, take it away, guys.
Thank you, Wendy, and hello to everybody viewing online. My name's Andrew Race. I'm the vicar up at St Edward's Castle Donington with St Nicholas Lockington in the shadow of East Midlands Airport and the plethora of distribution warehouses that are popping up and surrounding us these days, alongside hundreds and hundreds of new houses being built on the western side of the village. Now town, really, if size is anything to go by. We have our worship. We're back on site for our worship now on a Sunday, which is lovely. We are recording our Sunday worship and posting that on social media in an edited form later on the Sunday afternoon. And so my style of preaching, if you wish, has become very attentive to those who might be tuning in. And in our context, we have several hundred people who seem to follow what we do on a Sunday and listen in. So preaching and not knowing who's listening is really quite a challenge, and just being attentive. I mean, it's good discipline, being attentive to what is the core message here. And we will see from our readings today that, you know, that they are rich readings and we could try and cover everything, but I guess the discernment that we all have to wrestle with is what's the nugget that we're really going to try and impart. Do I use sporting as analogies? No. I don't. Occasionally, you know, if I'll tune into the rugby or the football. Is something going on in football at the moment? So so if it's good to affirm and to boost morale, then I might refer to it. But I'm sorry, I'm a sporting Luddite.
That's great. I think I'm next. Hi, I'm Bob. I'm a new rector. I've only been here 12 weeks, and behind me is unpacking still happening. I'm really finding out what on earth's going on. So I'm over in Kippax. I'm in Yorkshire, proper Yorkshire. I'm not from Yorkshire originally, but been here most of my adult life. And Kippax is it's a ex-mining community, and I have 3 churches, and they're all ex-mining communities. So I've got Swillington and Allerton Bywater as well, and we're a team ministry. And it's got a very traditional kind of mining feel to it. But again, like the rest, like Andrew's been saying, there's been a lot of new house building and a lot of change here, and Allerton Bywater was a designated Millennium Village and has had a lot of growth, and there's been a lot of positive change in the area with employment and stuff, but it still has that beautiful, strong community heritage from the mining, and of which I've been enjoying. So very traditional kind of place, traditional worship, and strength in things like weddings, baptisms, and funerals of everyone comes to the church. That's how you do stuff. So enjoying that. So preaching wise, I've been trying different things out, because when you're somewhere new, they don't know you, and it's kind of a bit like dating, isn't it? And you're just trying to work out what so last week I think I did a very traditional Bob sermon, heartbreaking tears type of thing. The week before I had a drama which I recorded on CD. My daughter recorded a monologue I wrote, and I've been trying out different things. So but I'm not actually preaching in Kippax this week. I'm over in Swillington, which I've only been to once before, because there's a team vicar over there. So that'll be a whole new thing, and I've got some ideas brewing about that. Sport, I'm not a sport person at all, and they're really into sport around here. If anyone's watching, I've just embarrassed myself. Castleford Tigers, it's rugby and stuff like that. But I did use a sport analogy last week because the football was just too much not to. But I don't normally use analogies. I'm terrible with jokes, so I don't do anything like that as well. So that's where I'm at the moment.
Thanks, Bob.
Hi, I'm Oliver. I'm rector of All Saints Church in the centre of Northampton, which Northampton is a sort of an ultra large market town these days that exploded with the new town movement, and so really we're one of the largest towns in England, and may even be about to become a city, which would be quite exciting in a way, and in a way a very sort of traditional town centre ministry with lots of things going on and lots happening in the town centre that's sort of coming to life again now that we are releasing from lockdown. And I always refer to it as Northampton's most historic roundabout, because all of the roads lead off into different parts of the town, like the leisure, the shopping, the museums and the theatres and everything else like that. But it's quite an exciting place to be. I've been here for nearly 5 years, so that's quite fun, really. We're worshipping, what's the phrase, on site and online nowadays, and we've just marked a year since we opened up last year for worship, and we've had a couple of bumps in the road, as we all have since then. But generally speaking, we've kind of kept to that and kept to a sort of hybrid worship arrangement where we're making sure we try to broadcast everything that we do. There's a little bit fly on the wall. It doesn't have the intimacy of being up close to the camera as we are now, but it's been quite a journey for me, really, sort of learning to deal with being observed in a very different way when I'm leading worship. So that's quite nice. I've got a bit of a history with sport, which is not entirely positive. And I've as a priest, I worked in Hull and in Birmingham and now in Northampton. And the year I went to Hull City were promoted to the Premiership just before I went there, and they were demoted in my first year. Same happened to Birmingham City. They were promoted and they were demoted in the same year I was there. And the same happened to Northampton, actually. So I get involved in sport very cautiously, because I know the damage and harm that that my deficient prayers caused the local football team. But I was credited by the Birmingham Mail with helping them to win the Carling Cup, thanks to a prayer I wrote in the local newspaper back in 2011. But generally, I sort of have a little bit of a fish out of water when it comes to sport. But I think it occasionally sort of creeps in there, and I think when it comes to preaching, that awareness of stuff that's going on outside as a kind of a throwaway line is quite sort of useful, really. We were talking about change last Sunday, and I very nearly got in the line yesterday's critical Marxist to today's national heroes, and so that's me.
Excellent. Oh, well, thank you guys, and it's great to have real different contexts for where we're preaching. People here will probably know the All Saints context, and I stay away from sport because I don't really do sport. Although I have got a warden and various members of my PCC and congregation who are Leicester City season ticket holders, and apparently they did something quite good recently as well. So we have to mention that at church. Well, while we've been saying hello, we have been joined by Helena, Michelle, Rachel, and Marek, and Penny are here. So welcome to you guys. Do please join in. You know what we do here. So let's dive into our scriptures, and we'll start, as we always do, with the gospel. So this passage in Mark chapter 6, beginning at verse 14, follows on from where we got to last week, but it's almost like this little interlude, because we're stepping into King Herod, and he's hearing about all this stuff that Jesus did, that we've heard about in the last couple of weeks in our gospel readings, and then he's wondering who Jesus is, wondering if this is John the Baptizer raised from the dead. And then we get the tale of how John the Baptist died. Andrew, you were going to kick off our conversation on this. Where are you going to go when you read this? What's leaping out at you? Is it, that's where the sermon should be going?
Well, we shall see. So as you've said, this is the story about John the Baptist, and I think the first thing I just want to note is just a little bit about context, and you've alluded to that already, Wendy, and that this story is sandwiched at the beginning and the end about the work and ministry of Jesus. So the previous verse before this one starts, the disciples went out and preached that the people should repent. They drove out many demons and anointed with oil many people who were ill and healed them. And then right at the end, verse 30, which is after our passage ends, the apostles gathered round Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. So something's going on here in the life and the ministry of Jesus that Herod has heard about and is hearing about. And I suppose two very simple points come to mind, and I'm not sure how I'd weave them into a preach, but I'd sort of have them there on my list. And the first is something along the lines of that the work of God, faithful discipleship, does not necessarily equal an easy life. Okay, so they're trucking along nicely, doing this ministry thing with Jesus alongside him, and they're seeing great results. And then boom, in the middle of it, there's this story, rather ugly story. And that happens in our daily lives. Being a disciple of Christ isn't necessarily easy. So just to have that in mind. But alongside that's really important to have in mind that whatever shenanigans go on, good, bad, evil, ugly, does not stop the work of God.
Right.
This is part of the world we live in, but God's work carries on. So it's in that context, really, that Herod, if you wish, is having a bit of a flashback, because actually in the kind of the sequence of events, John has been beheaded by now. And so Herod is hearing of the ministry of Jesus, and he thinks, "Oh my goodness, is this John been resurrected? Oh my goodness!" And now he's recalling all the stuff that he was involved in. And so we've got to then pause and think, well, what was that? What's going on here? Why has this story been put in? And I think I would probably want to pick up on some themes to do. In fact, I'd themed this sermon preach, truth versus power. And thinking a little bit more about it, I think there's something going on here that's a wrestle between authority and power. Truth, authority and power. And it's interesting, Herod in the narrative suggests that he was fearful of John. I think, actually, shouldn't that be the other way around? John's been put in prison. Shouldn't John be afraid of Herod? Herod appears to have this power as king, but looking at the historical context, and I know this is contested, so I'd have to be careful how I position this, as we all would. Herod, in fact, was a man of very weak character. And as the story goes on, actually, who had the real power in the story? It was his wife and his wife's daughter, along with, arguably, the crowd who were present at this gathering, this ball, this festival that was happening. Herod was somebody who sought to please the crowds. And again, that kind of raises an interesting question in our time as to how we make moral decisions in a context of a popular culture.
Yeah.
It's really, really interesting. So I'm not sure where this passage for me kind of raises many more questions than it does helpful answers, but it does gets us to think about, well, where does our authority, where does our power come from? How do we use our power, and where does it really lie? Herod's clearly drawn to John as a man of integrity, a man who speaks truth to power and isn't afraid to. And depending which version you read, it suggests that Herod was either puzzled, intrigued, wonder what was going on, or he did many things. You know, was John a bit of a mentor to him and saying, well, what about this, Herod? What about that? You know, yeah, I'm sure you locked me up, I'm in prison, and was Herod actually seeking to turn his life round all about? There's so many questions to this passage, aren't there? And yet, naughty old Herodias kind of has her way in the end. And isn't it interesting that, you know, this head gets presented on a platter? There's no emotion to this at all. It raises very interesting questions about what the pursuit of grudges and evil and wrongdoing does to our emotional and compassionate capacity. It hardens our hearts. And if there's one thing that's clear from the passage, it leaves hearts hardened. Which then, I suppose, leads me to a third thing just to think about, and that is just to ask the question, where are we in the story? Too often we readily side either with the good person in the story, or we remain as observers. But actually, might we be a Herod wrestling with our integrity and how we exercise the authority that's been given to us? Or have we got other agendas going on based on grudges and ill feelings? And are we, in fact, the ones behaving badly? Where is our moral compass in all of this? It's very easy to point the finger. But again and again and again, the gospel reflects back to us, if we read it carefully, something about our own lives and gets us to ask questions about our own lives.
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, you've opened that up brilliantly with so many of the themes that are in there. Rachel had been saying in the comments as you were talking that this story reminds me of the Old Testament story of the chap who promises to sacrifice to God the first thing that comes out of his house after he wins a battle. Then it ends up being his beloved daughter. She says it feels like a caution against blank checks and open promises. And of course, as you were touching on, Andrew, the playing to the crowd and populist culture. And you mentioned that idea of truth and power. Ollie, I know you in your ministry, you lead quite a civic church and I think you write a regular column in your sort of town paper, don't you? And so it's sort of in that public square space. Does this reading does this speak into that situation, or is it a good reminder to, I don't know, keep your head down? Or
I think so, yeah, and I think it is a reminder. I suppose as a preacher and a pastor, and I think that much more of the civic engagement that kind of goes on is it tends toward the pastoral and maybe the prophetic when you're lucky, rather than the preacher, which I think it's almost sort of natural in a way, and you sort of treasure the occasions when you can sort of stand before them and address people, because they are few and far between, and the number of times perhaps you'll listen to are even fewer than that. But I think the interaction between Herod and the Roman state and the people is just sort of fascinating, really. I was reading that elsewhere, because of course Herod isn't really a king, he's a tetrarch, he hopes to be a king, and he wants that kind of power. He wants to be able to do stuff, though what he wants to do is never entirely explained. Perhaps he just wants a quiet life and absolute power and things like that. And you can sort of see Mark edging toward telling us about his good intentions, but just how he ends up crucifying those good intentions despite every opportunity he has, and not least sort of here. But I think that what caught me, and sometimes when you're preparing to preach, the things that catch you are the things that arrive unexpected or unwelcomely, was just somebody I saw tweeting last night who said, this is a safeguarding story. This is a young girl who is manipulated by an adult into getting something else from another adult whom they wish to control. And it sort of jogged me and made me think, actually, well, it's been a while since you preached on safeguarding and why it's important. Perhaps now is the time, and this is the Sunday to do it. But just the sort of the dynamics there, and that's before you kind of get to gender in this gospel, and it was such an important facet of last Sunday's gospel.
That safeguarding thing, Ollie, isn't it? Is all about how we use our power, isn't it? So it's really, really interesting.
So, and the one here who is not powerful, the one who looks pathetic, apart from John, is Herod, and he's the one with the crown, and that's kind of that's kind of incredible, and that is about the limitations of people's authority and things like that. And I something that Rowan Williams said in a lecture years and years ago when he was talking about civic society is that Christians are called to be good citizens, but above all, they're called to sort of say to their leaders, well, look, we're going to be good citizens and we're going to support you and pray for you and uphold you and things like that. But ultimately, it's not to you that we look for authority. We're looking beyond and higher and for something ultimate and uniquely sustaining. And so however well we think of you, however well we get on, however much, the kind of the pastoral cups of coffee are so important. You're just a paper ruler, and our job is to perhaps help you get better than that, and be a merciful ruler and be a good ruler and to bear that well. And so I think that's what I'd sort of reflect, I suppose, from my historic roundabout.
Yeah, from your story, I love it. Thank you for that safeguarding angle. I hadn't seen that before, but you're quite right. There is a whole line you could go down there. Michelle had commented about the bit that she liked. Oh, it's now gone and scrolled up. You see, if you say too much, I lose you in the comments. What did you put, Michelle? That's it. She likes verse 20. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, but he liked to listen to him. She said it's kind of sweet. And so sometimes it's useful as a preacher to look at how the same story is recorded or not recorded in the synoptic gospels or the other gospels, and Mark's version of Herod is actually quite sympathetic in some ways, and sort of maybe suggesting that it was it's Herodias that's at fault, and sort of paints Herod as someone who is challenged by John, and is he trying to listen or not. Bob, you've been listening to all these reflections. Where do you go?
I had a very strong reaction for the first time. I mean, I've heard this passage hundreds of times. When I reread it again, I had an incredibly strong reaction to it because I've got a 14-year-old daughter, and suddenly I saw it in the context of a father, and my daughter who's blossoming and kind of discovering the world and all of those kind of things like you do. She's suddenly gone from kind of 14 to 25 in her mentality in the last few months. So I had a really strong reaction to that aspect of the story, and I'm a middle-aged man as well, and just that whole pagan and disgusting kind of image, if you like, scene that we find ourselves in. And for me, it contrasted with the other passages in an interesting way. So in Ephesians, we have, it's very set in worship, isn't it, and purity and searching for God. And I found there's this interesting contrast between the two passages in the scene that we find ourselves and what happens, and that in a way, once we're outside of worship, all sorts of things happen, not good things.
Yeah.
And and there was this kind of it was the worldliness of it that interested me, and I didn't go as far as the safeguarding, but that's a brilliant comment. Absolutely right. What's it doing to this girl? Yeah. But in a way, as that's what we see in the world around us as Christians. So my children are growing up in a Christian household. I was never brought up in a Christian household, but they are, and they're seeing those difficulties with the world. Of how to live and how to be true to your identity and discover what that is. So I'm thinking about this girl dancing there and what that's doing to her and what kind of family life you're in that allows that to happen, and thinking about my own family and families around us who are dealing with the world. And there was also a political edge to this as well, which I couldn't help thinking about some of the political things that have happened recently where wives have been cheated on and mistreated, and that somehow wasn't as important as whether they'd broken some rules, which are going to be abolished in 2 weeks' time anyway. And there was something about the moral vacuum that we're in, which really was strongly in the news that week. No personal condemnation of him. I've got absolutely nothing, no axe to grind, but it was just so obvious to me that there was no real moral thread to the political story, and that feels like it's brought out here. That you expect to be outraged by this passage. The writer's expecting you to have a moral aspect to it, and that in our contemporary society that's almost disappeared in the public sphere. We don't dare say that actually lots of people have been hurt here and badly treated. So that was my initial reflection. I'm quite a visual person and an artist, so I've already got my prop. I'm going to have a box. I don't know where this is going. I'm going to have a box and say what's inside the box and have it on a tray for the sermon. And I'm not sure where this is going. I won't have a severed head because I don't want to terrify my congregation.
Is this an all-age service, Bob?
No, it's not. No.
I was just wondering. Visual aids can be really good. Just to all our preachers listening, be careful of decapitated heads.
Yeah, I'm not going to have a decapitated head in it, but I was thinking having that there while I'm talking all the time will give a kind of edge, because people will be wondering what's in the box. The big question here around the scriptures, who is Jesus? That's what this is all in. That's what Mark's always asking. Who is this man? Who is Jesus? Hence the Elijah comment, because they'd be expecting an Elijah figure to come back before the new kingdom is set in place. So that's the concern, the interest. Is Jesus Elijah? Was John the Baptist Elijah? And John obviously took on that figure. So I think that the box with, what's in here with the mystery fits in well with this. I won't have a severed head, I promise. Okay. I don't know what's going to be in it yet, but it'll be something.
It was sounding a bit like a Brad Pitt movie for a
yeah.
Well, I have to rate in the comments. I think you should, Bob, get someone to stick their head up through a table. Yeah. This leads in all sorts of different directions. I really am grateful and fascinated where we've gone, and particularly the drawing out of the women and the young girl in this. I read this morning. I have to declare I read it because I'm not a Greek scholar. I did Greek for fun at theological college, and I wasn't very good at that either. But in my head, again, because in popular art and imagination, this young girl is the temptress, and she is this young, and all that, and also that kind of Western trope of Middle Eastern Oriental women being highly sexualized. But the Greek word apparently is the same word as used for the little girl who's healed. It's exactly the same word, who's a young girl. And actually, if you reread the passage and you see a young girl being asked to dance for Herod, that kind of desexualizes the passage straight away, and it gives it another kind of light to it. And you see the vulnerability of those who are being abused and manipulated. Lots of people chatting in the comments about Herod's role in this, and the fact that he's not very good. He tends to pass the buck in terms of sort of making a decision on anything. But we've spent a lot of time on the gospel, so we're just going to pause with that there. Some fascinating conversations there. We've got two other passages to look at, which we'll have to be a little briefer on. But let's go first to Ephesians, because Bob, you mentioned it. I think Ollie, you were going to kick off for us on it, but Bob, you said in what you were saying that there's a real contrast here. So if you've been with the lectionary, you'll know we've been in Corinthians the last few weeks. We now embark on another letter, the letter to the Ephesians. And I think this is like a sort of a chocolate cake reading, because this is just so beautiful and rich, and I'm sure it's also one of the canticles at morning prayer, or possibly evening prayer, just because I know it really well, and I don't have the Bible memorized. I'm not very good like that, but I know this passage really well. Ollie, what, as you read it, where do you go? It's really beautiful, I think.
It's incredibly beautiful, and I funnily enough, the first line of Barton and Muddiman's wonderful Oxford Bible commentary on Ephesians 1:3 begins with, "This is the most beautiful passage in the Bible," right the way to chapter 3 and to that phenomenal passage. I can only really think of David Ford reading this passage. He did a diocesan conference for us on this a few years ago. I bow my knees before the Father, before whom every family in heaven and earth is named. And I think and you start off with familiarity, don't you? And a text that recurs so often in the office, and that's that, whether you're using in the office for so many denominations as well, this recurs for Roman Catholics and for Anglicans. And so I think you have to do I start with doing a little bit of pause on this, because it does trip out of the head quite easily. It trips out of the head a little bit more easily if I sing it, which, well, that tells you where both you and I trained, isn't it? And because of that, I just sort of sit there a little bit and just make sure I've remembered the words right, and dwell on them a little bit. And I think that's a really interesting thing to do with scripture when you're preparing to preach. I'm not a person who prepares a long time in advance, unless I know that it's a kind of something I really need to get right. And I think that kind of Saturday evening, writing something very quickly, not dwelling on it enough, it's not good enough for a passage like this from Ephesians because of its familiarity. And I think where I go with it is probably it's probably really to sort of plough the depths of what this kind of hymn or prayer means, what it means to Jews in their liturgical usage of Barakah prayers, of blessing prayers, what it means to us in our present usage, and that sort of allows you to track back and track forward to worship that extends over several thousands of years, and to be able to say, well, what are we doing here when we say blessed be God? What are we doing when we talk about blessing us in Christ with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places, about the extent of the love and grace of God, and how that and how are we going to try and, we can't measure, but how are we going to try and perceive that extent? There's a great author who does some work on Maximus the Confessor, and talks about the relationship between word and flesh, and talking about the word inhabiting matter, flesh being almost synonymous in his writings with the idea of matter and the sheer building blocks of the universe, and that grace and mercy extends through that, and is not limited to what we see or what we are or anything else like that. So I think that's where I start, is actually the limitless grace of God, the boundless love of God, and then really reflecting on how we account for that in our worship, and what we say when we pray, what we say when we worship, and possibly ending with a tilt to the Barakah prayers that we use in our Eucharistic rites when we do the taking of the bread and the wine, because I think that action of taking is a little bit underused as a prop, if you like, and as a considerable part of liturgical rite, and especially at the moment where we're only permitted to receive in one kind or in two kinds in a very limited way. Talking afresh about how we pray and how we worship, and that seems to me a way of taking it.
Thank you. You're quite. I'm another Saturday night. Sometimes, if I'm desperate, early Sunday morning preach, and every week vow I must do better. But you're quite right. Passages like this and the familiarity, you miss over the richness of what the text is in front of you. Andrew, what about you in this text? Let me come back to you next as you listen. You're muted. Oh, that was a beautiful hand gesture.
As Ollie said, it is a beautiful, rich passage, and it just sums up in, if you can call it a nutshell, both the breadth and the depth of Paul's, if Paul wrote it, Paul's theology, and it kind of gives us a real grounding, some real substantive anchor points. I think Bob mentioned, when we were reflecting on the gospel reading, the whole point of the gospel reading was to point to Jesus. This passage reminds us that our focus is on the saving grace of God. And this isn't a new thing. This is something that has been since God created time, if I can put it that way, that threads all the way through that blessing, that grace. I read somewhere that the word that is used in here for grace ties very closely, to the Hebrew word hesed, meaning God's loving kindness, mercy, and faithfulness, as we understand what that grace is. And the astonishing thing is, through Jesus, we have access not just to this life-giving grace of the living God, but that does something to who we are. We become his children, his family, heirs to the kingdom of God. I can't get my head around that. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. And Rachel in the comments is really struck by the whole thing about he chose us. It's so that the way around that it goes is that, we are forgiven because he loved us first, not we are loved because we are forgiven. And that expansive love of God for us. It's just beautiful. Bob, you touched on it briefly when you were saying, because for you it really contrasts with the gospel reading. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, there's an exuberance, isn't there, in this beautiful language and in these long sentences, which occasionally you read and forget where the grammar is because there wasn't any grammar in the original Greek, and they're just long. It's like you can feel Paul's passion and his worship of Christ in this, and this high Christology that we're seeing here, more so even than the Gospels themselves. And what really interested me, I think what Ollie brought out, was this embodiment of our worship in the physical matter, and it ties in really well also with the Samuel reading, where we have the embarrassment of David in a way, exuberantly using his body to worship, the noise and the scorn that he receives for that. And in a way, Paul's doing the same thing, but through language. So one is describing a physical thing you could experience, and Paul is expressing that through this language. So it's about worship, and who we're worshiping. And in one way, the Old Testament reading is expressing the depth of our passion for God through action and through the noise and through the ritual of what's going on. In Ephesians, we're hearing it with these great grand ideas and the beauty of the language, and they're doing the same thing but in different ways. And it kind of reminded me of on a Sunday morning, we're not just saying words. That's what's beautiful about the Catholic tradition. In a way that you're embodying what's and what you're believing through action and through ritual. The evangelical tradition, you're embodying it through energy and through making a lot of noise sometimes and everything else. So, but both reflect different ways that we worship and touch us in different ways. So that's my simple reflection.
Thank you, that's lovely. And I'm going to stay with you in a moment, just because we'll stay with the Samuel. Hannah reiterates with this passage, if we were only loved once we were forgiven, it implies we're unlovable in our unforgiven state. And that's not just true, IMHO, which is what the youth say, for in my humble opinion. Hannah, I think we're probably on the same page as you there. And I love what you were saying about that, the embodiment of worship. Marek's just popped up. Marek, thank you. It's amazing that no matter what we do, God loves us. There is nothing we can do for him to love us any less or any more than he already done. It's mind-blowing, quite right. And Helena's given us lots of smiley faces. You can't beat an emoji in the comments. We've only got about 5 minutes left, so let's Bob, couple of minutes on the Samuel. You've alluded to the fact that it's worship, David's dancing. If you've not looked it up yet, it's the ark coming back in. There's a bit the lectionary mixes out where it all gets a bit awkward because someone touches the ark, then they die. The lectionary jumps over that bit, and lots of embodied worship. Bob, any more you want to say on this?
I mean, yeah, there's. I think the kind of military use of worship is quite an interesting one here. I've got one side of my family Israeli, and they all serve in the Israeli forces. This is an awkward conversation to have, so cousins dressed, young 19-year-old cousins, women with Kalashnikovs, dressed up, and there's something about the military and the military state and religion being mixed together, which is quite interesting for me here, and that reverberates in a very dangerous way down through the ages to our current time with the Israeli-Arab conflict that's going on. Just your king being naked and dancing, or semi-naked and dancing. I don't think many of us will lead worship on Sunday just wearing an ephod like that, or not. And there's something about the exuberance of that, and that how often we're quite. I don't know how you worship on a Sunday here. It's quite traditional. I would imagine if I started jumping around and dancing semi-naked with a tambourine, that there would be a phone call to the bishop from my church wardens. But what is the place for exuberance in our worship is one of the things that's come out for me from this passage.
Thanks, Bob. I'm going to bring yours because we're sort of rattling with time. Ollie, do you have reflections on this when you read this passage?
I got caught. My eye got caught by Michal, daughter of Saul, kind of peering down and what was the word? It despised him in her heart because he was leaping and dancing before the Lord. But I've never been particularly moved just to wear an ephod to church. I don't think my bishop would be surprised. That's the trouble. But
you mentioned Michal. I mean, of course, she is. She was David's wife, and she loved David. And this poor woman. I think there's a whole nother sermon which will take you in a different direction about this woman's story, because she gets palmed off to David, then gets palmed off to someone else, and is kind of a little pawn in this. So I wonder what it is that she's really. What is she despising? And maybe because she knows that he's actually, he's a bit of a player, is our David.
Yeah. I think that's the sort of the fascinating thing about this passage and the Mark passage, is that it's full of incidental characters about which we don't, we sometimes don't know an awful lot, or about whom the narrative doesn't say an awful lot. I love sort of the Josephus history about John the Baptist, delving into Herodias and her daughter and things like that, and into Herod as well. And I love those because they're a little bit Gnostic, because you never quite know where they're going to go to. It's a lot of speculation, a lot of almost secret knowledge. But I think just imagining what it might be to be in the footsteps of those who were there, and what it would have been to be David's wife and peering at David as he was, histrionically sort of casting off his clothing and, offering oxes and fatlings every time he took 6 steps and things like that. It's extraordinary. And what would it have been to be in Herod's court and to capture just bits of that? And I love those eyes, I think, and I kind of want those eyes, and just a little bit of almost meditation, so long as it doesn't become a distraction or sort of to a degree idolatrous. It leads to really interesting places, and the work that Sam Wells and Julian Chalcott Monk have done on that kind of storytelling, I think is just beautiful.
Thank you, Ollie. But let's maybe not have the prop actually for this one. I don't know. We'll have to give it to Bob for props. Andrew, what about yourself and the 2 Samuel text?
Yeah, I mean, of course, how do you pronounce her name? Michal, I don't quite know how it is. Not only was married to David, but wasn't she Saul's daughter?
Yeah.
And of course, at this point, Saul is dead. The whole household is dead. And David now has stepped in as anointed king. And he's behaving in quite a flamboyant and, what's the word, a sort of indulgent way. And I'm just wondering whether this is causing it, or what is this the legacy of my father going on here? There's a little bit of it, a bit like in the Mark reading, there's a little bit of a grudge going on about that might be the root of her despising of David. It'd be interesting to reflect, isn't it? And just got me thinking, in all these stories, or both of those stories, and in so many of our stories, there's something to do with what the brokenness or the toxicity of family, how that can get in the way of our worship of God. And how do we bring that in all its pain before God to be transformed rather than be transmitted because we're not dealing with it?
Yeah, thank you. I feel like we could just do another half hour on this
Couldn't we?
passage. I think there's so much, but we are out of time, and I want to honor the time of my guests today. So as you'll know, my regulars here, we always wrap up by just asking my guests, okay, if they're preaching on Sunday, these are the lectionary, what kind of sermon is shaping up for them? I'm going to almost go back around the way we've just landed. So Andrew, you've already said at the start, you tend to try and get the nub because you're really aware of a congregation who may almost be passing through. What kind of sermon is bubbling up for you?
Yeah, I'm confused now.
Well, I'm glad we've helped. I aim to do this.
Let's be honest. Sometimes we have to wrestle with these things. I've said this before, haven't I? And I think I might just lay that honesty before people. These are things we have to wrestle with, and we have to wrestle with the life that we bring before God and before the text, and we've got to wrestle that within the context of an amazing God at work through time and history, and who does and can work in our lives today. And we have a choice as to how we engage with that, and then tie that in, I guess, with the power that we all have in our different ways to choose how to engage with that. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. I set this up to help me with my sermon prep, but quite rightly, often I end up with more things to think about. I'm sure that's a good thing. Ollie, what about yourself? What kind of sermon are you sitting with?
I think Providence determines that I never really write my sermon until I've sort of written it, and when it gets down on paper on Saturday night, and the rest of the week is percolation, really. And maybe it'll depend on whether another government minister gets caught in flagrante. Or again, I think that what's eye-catching and appealing, and it might be time for a safeguarding sermon, I think, because that's sort of come out there. What's eye-catching and appealing is that kind of that history about telling things about John the Baptist, and recounting the Josephus stuff, and just capturing some of the context, because this is this flashback in Mark. And Mark doesn't seem to lend himself very well to that kind of flashback, flash forward. But I think that's what's capturing me, is actually let's reach back and see how far the grace goes.
Excellent. And we're all online these days, so you can catch any of these sermons, I presumably, on various people's websites, Facebook pages, YouTube channels, for good and for ill. Bob, what about yourself? Where are you going to go, apart from with your visual aid? Because
I've got my visual aid, so I think it's going to be about power, probably here. And I love the comment we had. I can't remember if it's Ollie, I think it was Andrew, about who has the real power here. I think that's a really interesting thing to explore, and I think I'm kind of thinking about the context and the anxiety that's going on this week, so I'll have to deal with that in some way in the sermon. I've not made that connection yet, but I've got my prop and I've got something about power, and it will come together through the week, usually when I've slept on it a bit.
The grace of God always at work, kind of like pulling these threads together. That's what we pray for. And for me personally, I'm not preaching at All Saints. I think if I was, I'm really drawn to, I think that the Samuel and the Ephesians reading more, and the idea of symbols of worship, because again, the whole thing of how we worship, and we don't have much space to be exuberant, and but something about that. But I'm a guest preacher somewhere else, and it's one of those occasions where I've been asked to speak on a topic, so I need to relay that back into the passages. I'm going to preach at another parish who are exploring the inclusive church theme, so are going to be preaching on sexuality and gender identity and inclusion. So I think, assuming they might use the lectionary, but the Ephesians text just blows me away. The expansive love of God for everyone. And I think that's probably the kind of sermon that I will end up shaping up. But fascinated by some of the conversations we've had today. So huge thank you to my guest, Andrew. Always good to have to welcome you back for the wisdom from the East Midlands, Amazon Depot parish, and to Ollie and Bob for joining me for the first time. I do hope you'll be back. It's great to have your wisdom here, and thank you to everyone for joining in. You're having a great chat there about the role of women and infertility and all sorts. I shall leave you to that in the comments, but do join me next week when I think I can announce, because I don't think my rotor's got too messed up after I sent it out, welcoming back 3 familiar faces: David Welsh from Guildford Diocese, Rachel Firth from God's Own County of Yorkshire, and Chris Taylor, University Chaplain here in Loughborough. So do join me next week as we come again to muse on the scriptures.